The village of Little Netherford had long been accustomed to a certain rhythm of civility, measured and habitual, where the chief excitement rarely extended beyond the annual flower show or the occasional debate over parish funds. It was, therefore, a matter of understated comment when a wandering preacher, Mr. Elias Fenwick, arrived to lecture at the parish hall, his manner polite but faintly probing. Mrs. Constance Darrow, the recent widow of some local note, offered him tea in her drawing-room, a gesture ostensibly simple, yet polished with the precise attention of a hostess aware that observation was in itself a form of currency. The china was arranged meticulously, no spoon or sugar cube was out of place. Fenwick accepted the refreshment with discreet thanks, his eyes, however, noting minor irregularities in the placement of the vases and the faint scent of rosewater that might otherwise have gone unremarked. Inspector Purbright, summoned under the guise of routine parish oversight, watched from the window as parishioners arrived to hear the stranger speak. He observed the way their polite greetings were slightly too long, as if elongated by the effort to conceal private judgments. The preacher's arrival was ostensibly a religious matter, yet Purbright noted the subtle ripple of social recalibration. The committee chairs exchanged glances, the rector adjusted his cufflinks with particular care, and the postmistress, whose loyalty was reputedly as unbending as the parish ledgers, offered an almost imperceptible frown. Fenwick's sermon, delivered with a voice neither commanding nor timid, carried gentle admonitions regarding propriety and moral vigilance. The congregation listened attentively, though the attention was strained in the way it always is when polite society is confronted with reflections of its own foibles. Some muttered softly under their breath, others nodded with the faintest quiver of uncertainty, as if balancing the need to appear pious with the discomfort of implied scrutiny. Mrs. Darrow, seated in the front row, maintained a composed expression that suggested both interest and cautious calculation. She had been widowed only recently, and her reputation, like her tea service, required careful tending. During the interval, Purbright approached Mrs. Darrow, ostensibly to inquire after her comfort, though in truth to gauge her subtle reactions. She spoke in measured tones, excusing minor lapses in the arrangement of the hall, and explaining the absence of a few committee members with a precise blend of candour and discretion. Purbright listened, noting that her explanations, though superficially plausible, bore the faint signature of someone accustomed to managing perception. He made a mental note of the parishioners who avoided her glance, and of those whose overly ingratiating attention seemed more strategic than sincere. A letter arrived during the latter part of the sermon, placed unobtrusively on the vicar's desk. Its contents were not dramatic, a minor complaint about the preacher's emphasis on moral correction, but the mere act of writing and delivering it hinted at the underlying frictions that, while invisible to the casual observer, were alive and persistent. The vicar, a man of habitual gentleness, did not read it aloud, yet his fingers lingered over the envelope with a faint tension. Purbright, ever attentive to the subtleties of human behaviour, noted this, along with the swift glance the postmistress cast toward the letter, as if measuring the potential consequences for the village's delicate balance of reputation. After the sermon concluded, the congregation dispersed with the same quiet decorum that had accompanied its assembly. Conversations were polite, yet thinly veiled critiques and reassurances wove their way between the villagers. Fenwick accepted Mrs. Darrow's invitation to supper, a gesture of social courtesy that carried the weight of potential implications. To dine with the widow was to enter a space of influence and discretion. Purbright observed the careful choreography of their interaction. Each polite smile, each measured nod, each subtle adjustment of posture suggested awareness of reputation, a tacit acknowledgement that appearances were themselves instruments of social governance. As dusk fell, Purbright strolled the village square, noting the absence of overt excitement yet the presence of a distinct tension in the air. The shopkeepers closed with particular attention to detail, shutters aligned neatly, and no unnecessary clatter disturbed the quiet. A passing villager, encountering the inspector, offered a greeting that lingered longer than polite custom required, their eyes betraying mild curiosity and faint apprehension. From the corner of his eye, Purbright saw Fenwick and Mrs. Darrow in earnest conversation near the church gates, their gestures restrained yet pointed in subtle emphasis. The inspector, reflecting on the day, recognized that nothing overtly irregular had occurred, yet an intricate web of observation, expectation, and understated unease had been woven. He considered the preacher's role not merely as a visitor or a spiritual guide, but as a subtle agent of social introspection capable of exposing latent resentments under the guise of moral instruction. Mrs. Darrow's poised comportment suggested a woman accustomed to managing both her own reputation and those of others, yet the faintest tremor in her composure hinted at uncertainties that might, if pursued, reveal concealed truths. A final, almost imperceptible observation clinched the day's impressions. The postmistress, usually stoic and unflappable, paused at her doorway and murmured a phrase that the wind carried faintly to Purbright's ears. "Some visitors unsettle loyalties quietly." The inspector allowed the words to linger in his mind, a subtle question poised, an invitation to the day's inquiry yet to unfold. As night fell over Little, Netherford, he recognized that the true mystery lay not in spectacle or overt scandal, but in the delicate interplay of civility, suspicion, and silent ambition. The morning following the preacher's arrival, Little Netherford settled into an atmosphere of tentative curiosity, the kind that manifests not in overt excitement, but in the careful arrangement of curtains and the conspicuous brushing of coats before departing the front door. Mrs. Constance Darrow, having extended hospitality with admirable decorum, insisted upon hosting a tea for the village committees. The gathering, ostensibly convened to discuss the forthcoming charity bazaar, quickly became an exercise in silent evaluation, each participant observing not merely the speaker but the precise manner in which others listened. The china clinked lightly, sugar cubes were carefully transferred, and the steam rising from delicate cups seemed almost symbolic of the restrained emotions that simmered just below the surface. Purbright, who had been invited under the guise of mere oversight, found his attention drawn to the interplay of gestures and half-phrases. The chair of the flower committee, a lady of formidable dignity and meticulously arranged coiffure, spoke at length about floral arrangements, yet the subtext suggested a preoccupation with the personal motives of her neighbours. The choir mistress, seated opposite, replied with such deliberate sweetness that the words felt almost weaponized, each compliment concealing the faintest trace of rivalry. Fenwick, conspicuously absent, was mentioned several times, each reference carefully measured. Too much curiosity would appear gauche, too little inattentive. Mrs. Darrow facilitated the conversation with practiced precision, offering polite interruptions that steered potentially contentious remarks into safer channels while never losing control of the social hierarchy. The parish newsletter lay on the table, its crisp pages freshly printed yet suffused with understated innuendo. Articles praised the virtue of local residents, while subtly hinting at lapses in conduct, employing phrases like an admirable dedication to appearances, or a generosity of spirit that may inspire or caution the discerning observer. Purbright noted the careful avoidance of specifics. The sentences danced around truths without fully disclosing them. Observing the reactions of the committee members, he found subtle tremors of recognition and discomfort, an almost imperceptible stiffening of posture, a brief narrowing of eyes, indications that reputations were being privately reassessed. Letters were exchanged during the tea, delivered with quiet ceremony, and read with attentiveness that went beyond polite curiosity. One missive, carried by the postmistress herself, praised the vicar for maintaining moral standards while hinting at an uncomfortable disquiet caused by a recent visitor. It was phrased as a compliment, yet functioned in its obliqueness as a subtle accusation. Purbright recorded the reactions in his mental ledger. The widow's slight smile did not reach her eyes. The choir mistress's hand trembled faintly as she placed her cup back on its saucer. The inspector noted these details with the professional detachment of one accustomed to measuring the invisible weight of social expectation. Discussions of the charity bazaar unfolded with gentle precision, yet the subtext revealed competing ambitions. Who would oversee the stalls, who would adjudicate the raffle, who would determine the placement of exhibits? All were matters of social significance, each choice carrying implications for influence and reputation. Mrs. Darrow managed these questions with subtle authority, making suggestions couched in the form of inquiries and praising concessions that were merely inevitable. Purbright, who had observed similar patterns in other villages, recognized that the widow was testing allegiances, gauging the extent to which civility could mask ambition. Amid the polite chatter, Fenwick's name reappeared in discussion, cited as a figure whose advice might be enlightening, yet required cautious application. Purbright observed a ripple of unease when a committee member mentioned the preacher's comments on old loyalties and private debts, phrasing it as though it were common knowledge. Murmurs ensued, politely discreet but tinged with barely suppressed curiosity. It was clear to the inspector that the preacher's presence had shifted more than the social order. It had prompted reflection on past behaviours, exposing minor hypocrisies and unacknowledged grievances, all conducted beneath the veneer of genteel discussion. After the tea, the participants dispersed, leaving behind the faint aroma of Earl Grey and the subtle residue of anxiety. Purbright lingered to inspect the newsletter more closely. He noted that paragraphs praising moral fortitude were consistently followed by suggestions that even the most conscientious villagers might benefit from reflection. Each line seemed designed to prompt introspection without overt accusation, a careful, almost artful manipulation of conscience. The inspector could not determine whether this was the work of the printer, the editor, or some invisible hand within the community, but he filed the observation carefully. A final, almost imperceptible incident drew Purbright's attention as he left the hall. The postmistress, who had remained behind to tidy the table, glanced toward Mrs. Darrow, and then, briefly, toward the street outside, as though considering the ramifications of someone's impending departure. Her expression was fleeting, yet precise, conveying awareness without revelation. The inspector, noting the subtlety of this communication, wondered if a minor exchange of information or a whispered warning had taken place, unremarkable to any observer but pregnant with potential significance. As he walked back toward the vicarage, Purbright considered the patterns of behaviour, polite corrections, measured smiles, the calculated deflection of attention. Little Netherford had presented its usual facade of order, yet beneath the calm surface, the arrival of the preacher had begun to unsettle loyalties, reveal fissures, and provoke careful self-examination. The day's observations, unremarkable in isolation, collectively suggested that the village's equilibrium was delicately contingent on civility and silence. And in the lingering shadow of the tea, Purbright glimpsed the faintest question: how much of this politeness concealed truth, and how much masked ambition? The answer, he sensed, would unfold quietly, in small gestures and subtle revelations yet to come. The morning air in Little Netherford carried a faint chill, crisp enough to encourage brisk walking, yet soft enough to preserve the village's customary stillness. The churchyard gate creaked with measured regularity as Purbright approached the vicarage, letters in hand, their neat envelopes promising insight into concerns both genuine and imaginatively construed. The recent arrival of Mr. Fenwick, though outwardly unremarkable, had prompted an unusual flurry of correspondence, ranging from polite inquiry to the thinly veiled reproach one might expect when minor reputations were, however subtly, perceived to be at risk. Mrs. Constance Darrow received Purbright with her customary grace, tea prepared as if by ritual, biscuits arranged in perfect symmetry. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "you are most punctual. I trust the morning finds you well." The words were polite, yet beneath them Purbright detected a faint calculation. Her eyes scanned his expression for the slightest indication of awareness, as if she were rehearsing a delicate negotiation with his discretion. He inclined his head, replying with equal civility, conscious that the subtext mattered far more than the phrase itself. Purbright's attention turned to the letters, which he had requested from the vicar's modest collection. One, typed in formal script, praised Fenwick's intellect while hinting that his presence might provoke unnecessary reflection upon long-settled matters. Another, written in a delicate hand, praised Mrs. Darrow's generosity while subtly questioning her judgment in inviting a stranger so untested into the village's moral orbit. Each document revealed the characteristic paradox of Little Netherford: politeness as a shield, civility as a weapon, the concealment of unease beneath layers of etiquette. As tea was poured, the conversation navigated the usual channels of local life: upcoming parish fundraisers, the repair of the old iron railings, and the precise scheduling of committee meetings. Yet beneath the surface, Purbright discerned minor fissures, hints of old grievances reawakened. The choir mistress, seated just beyond the widow, remarked in passing upon the diligence of recent flower arrangements. Her tone, measured and sweetly courteous, carried a trace of admonition. It was not the flowers themselves, but the meticulousness of the organizer that drew attention. Mrs. Darrow, displaying exemplary composure, responded with acknowledgment, carefully maintaining a balance between gratitude and social dominance. Mid-morning brought another subtle disturbance. A stack of invitations had been delivered, announcing a lecture by Fenwick at the village hall. Purbright observed the reactions of those present, noting variations in tone and posture that suggested differing levels of anxiety or anticipation. Several villagers, particularly those with reputations for meticulous propriety, seemed ill at ease, exchanging quick, whispering consultations that were, by design, too low for casual observers to catch. The careful phrasing of questions: "Might I presume the evening will proceed according to usual decorum?" belied a nervous interest in potential improprieties, a preoccupation with reputation that the inspector catalogued with mild amusement. While examining the letters and invitations, Purbright noted the subtle economy of phrasing. A compliment was tempered by a caveat, an observation accompanied by a shadow of doubt. The stylistic restraint was remarkable. No one could accuse these correspondents of overt hostility, yet each sentence contained a kernel of social interrogation. He observed that Mrs. Darrow, while outwardly gracious, was acutely aware of the implications of each statement. Her smiles, measured and polite, were deployed as both reassurance and subtle dominance. Purbright ventured a gentle inquiry about Fenwick's intentions, phrasing it indirectly. "Do we understand whether Mr. Fenwick's visits are to be recurring?" he asked, his tone mild yet probing. Mrs. Darrow's eyes flickered briefly to a small stack of folded envelopes, then back to his face. "He has expressed a desire to be of assistance," she replied, carefully neutral. "Assistance in what form one cannot presume, but I have every confidence in the propriety of the events he attends." Her measured words, however, carried a nuance of uncertainty, and the inspector noted the faint tension in her hands as she arranged the remaining tea biscuits. The discussion soon turned to historical parish concerns, particularly minor financial discrepancies, and the subtle politics of committee appointments. A statement regarding a bequest was phrased as neutral, yet the phrasing, "It is hoped that all parties will maintain decorum and propriety in managing said funds," hinted at prior incidents or unspoken rivalries. Purbright made careful mental notes. The villagers' politeness masked unease, their civility belied latent disputes. Fenwick, though absent, had become a catalyst for reflection, causing minor hypocrisies to surface without overt confrontation. As the morning drew to a close, Purbright rose to depart, observing the faint exchange between the widow and the postmistress. Their eyes met briefly, the postmistress tilting her head in a gesture almost imperceptible, conveying either warning or information, or perhaps merely speculation. Purbright, who had become attentive to such subtleties, filed the observation with meticulous care. The day had revealed little in the way of concrete revelation, yet a web of social cues, minor contradictions and cautious observations was forming. The final impression lingered as he walked toward the vicarage gates. Little Netherford remained outwardly composed, yet beneath the polished civility, reputations quivered, letters carried hidden significance, and a stranger's presence had set the subtle machinery of scrutiny into motion. A question, unspoken but palpable, seemed to hover in the air. Which of these ostensibly minor tensions would eventually reveal the truth, and who would be the first to miscalculate its consequences? Purbright, as always, knew that answers in this village arrived slowly, wrapped in courtesy and silence. The supper club convened that evening in Mrs. Darrow's drawing-room, a gathering ostensibly devoted to literary discussion, yet in practice an exhibition of social navigation. Candles flickered gently on the polished sideboard, casting elongated shadows that mirrored the careful calculations of the assembled guests. Purbright noted the seating arrangement at once. Mrs. Darrow, host and moderator, had placed the more assertive committee members opposite the quieter, more observant attendees, a subtle orchestration designed to maintain equilibrium while encouraging minor revelations. Fenwick, the preacher, occupied a seat of careful neutrality, his posture attentive but restrained, as though prepared to observe the interplay of propriety and ambition without influencing it overtly. The conversation began with polite commentary on recent publications, yet within moments drifted to the customary undercurrent of social appraisal. "It is remarkable," remarked the choir mistress, her voice as smooth as varnish, "how certain novels illuminate tendencies one might otherwise overlook in familiar acquaintances." The comment, ostensibly literary, carried a subtle sting. The Flower Committee chair's faint smile did not quite reach her eyes, and Purbright, ever sensitive to the subtext of civility, noted the brief tightening of her fingers around her teacup. Mrs. Darrow intervened with a gentle remark about the virtues of temperance and discernment, restoring a measured tone while reminding all present of the hierarchy she silently maintained. Fenwick's contributions were sparing yet incisive. He observed that the moral lessons of literature, though often subtle, could reveal much about an individual's response to scrutiny. His phrasing was careful, deferential even, yet carried the weight of insinuation. Those who considered themselves beyond reproach shifted uneasily. Purbright recorded the nuances, slight hesitations, the barely perceptible glance exchanged between committee members, and the small coughs that punctuated otherwise smooth conversation. These were the signals of hidden concerns, reputations being weighed and recalibrated under the veneer of polite dialogue. The discussion turned to the forthcoming charity bazaar, a subject that, despite its innocuous appearance, had become a locus of strategic positioning. Who would supervise the bookstall, adjudicate the raffle, and oversee refreshments were questions fraught with unspoken implications. The choir mistress suggested one arrangement with sweet precision, prompting an equally polite counter-proposal from the flower committee chair. Mrs. Darrow mediated with elegance, praising each idea while subtly emphasizing the alignment of authority and propriety. Purbright noted that the debate, though superficially amicable, functioned as a means of observing loyalties and testing boundaries without open confrontation. Intermittently, minor revelations surfaced, cloaked in civility. The vicar, who had been unusually silent, remarked upon the careful attention required in managing legacies and donations. His words, ostensibly mundane, were punctuated by the faintest hesitation, suggesting past difficulties that remained unspoken. Fenwick's response was courteous, a neutral acknowledgement that implicitly reinforced his role as observer rather than participant. Purbright, attentive to the rhythms of social interaction, noted that even absence of accusation could exert pressure, and that silence in Little Netherford often conveyed as much as speech. As the supper progressed, Purbright observed the subtle orchestration of gestures and glances. Mrs. Darrow, pouring tea with unerring precision, allowed herself the occasional, almost imperceptible lift of the brow when she perceived deviation from her carefully maintained decorum. The guests, in turn, moderated their behavior, offering comments measured in both tone and content. It was a dance of civility, each participant acutely aware that misstep could invite scrutiny or minor social reprisal. Purbright reflected that in this village moral authority was exercised not through confrontation, but through observation and the strategic deployment of politeness. A particular moment caught his attention. The postmistress, who had been seated quietly at a corner table, brushed crumbs from the tablecloth with unusual deliberation. Her movements were not clumsy, but there was a subtle insistence in the gesture, a faint tension that suggested the management of an internal concern. Purbright, who had learned to interpret such signs, filed the behavior as noteworthy. It was neither overtly significant nor dramatic, yet, in the quiet context of Little Netherford, it carried a weight disproportionate to its appearance. The evening drew to a close with customary expressions of thanks and farewells, each as carefully constructed as the arrangements of china on the sideboard. Guests departed with measured grace, leaving behind the faint aroma of tea and polished wood, and an atmosphere laden with unspoken evaluations. Fenwick lingered briefly with Mrs. Darrow, their conversation inaudible to others, though Purbright, watching from the edge of the room, detected a subtle exchange of gestures, a tilt of the head, a measured hand movement, both suggestive of confidences shared quietly, without need for words. As Purbright stepped out into the evening chill, he reflected on the delicate tension that underpinned the village's social structure. No overt conflict had occurred, no scandal had been aired. Yet the interactions he had observed hinted at minor hypocrisies, unacknowledged rivalries, and carefully concealed ambitions. Mrs. Darrow's authority remained intact, Fenwick's role as observer subtly influential, and the villagers themselves demonstrated the remarkable resilience of polite intrigue. A final impression lingered, quiet but insistent. As Purbright walked toward the vicarage gates, he noted a shadowy figure pausing at a corner, briefly regarding the supper club's departing guests. The figure's expression, unreadable yet attentive, suggested awareness beyond mere curiosity, as if some minor piece of the social puzzle had been observed and filed for later consideration. The inspector, with his habitual patience, noted the subtle shift and allowed a faint, cautious question to enter his mind. Which among these carefully managed appearances would ultimately reveal a truth hidden beneath layers of civility? The night remained calm, but in Little Netherford, calm could be as revealing as disturbance. The vicarage study was quiet in the early afternoon, suffused with the faint scent of old parchment and polished wood. Purbright had requested access to the parish records under the guise of routine oversight, Yet he was aware that such inquiries in Little Netherford often provoked subtle apprehension. The books themselves were neat, their pages lined with dates, bequests, and minutes of committee meetings. But Purbright's trained eye immediately discerned minor anomalies, entries that had been amended without explanation, absences in otherwise consistent records, and notes of contributions that carried ambiguous phrasing. Each discrepancy, though small, suggested both inadvertence and deliberate omission, and he noted them with the careful patience of one accustomed to silent observation. Mrs. Darrow, ever gracious, attended him with a polite attentiveness, offering tea and biscuits while ensuring that the arrangement of papers remained unspoiled. "You will find," she remarked in her measured tone, "that the records are generally complete, though one must forgive minor gaps due to clerical error or the infirmities of memory." Her statement, superficially modest, carried a subtle warning. The inspection was tolerated, not entirely welcomed. Purbright accepted the tea with formal thanks, all the while observing the minute tremor in her hands as she rearranged a stack of letters, an almost imperceptible sign of anxiety carefully concealed beneath civility. The books revealed curious entries regarding legacies, some of which had been noted as conditional upon discretion. One minute described a donation from an anonymous benefactor, annotated with a phrase suggesting concern over its reception by certain committee members. Purbright reflected that the social web of the village relied upon both the concealment and revelation of information, often in precisely measured portions. He noted the subtle coding in the phrasing. Words like "considered prudent" and "deemed appropriate" suggested social negotiation rather than administrative necessity, and he filed these observations meticulously. While examining a ledger of recent contributions, Purbright noticed that certain names appeared in multiple contexts, yet with slight variations in spelling or date. These minor inconsistencies could easily be dismissed, yet in a village where reputation was scrupulously guarded, they were worthy of attention. He made a mental note to compare these with letters and minutes from committee meetings, recognizing that the interplay of record-keeping and human discretion often revealed more than conversation alone. Mrs. Darrow, sensing the inspector's scrutiny, offered explanations with the practiced precision of someone skilled in the management of perception. "It is not uncommon," she said, "for older records to be amended as circumstances evolve. One must balance transparency with propriety, lest one create unnecessary alarm." Purbright acknowledged her statement politely, aware that beneath her phrasing lay both defensiveness and subtle guidance. He discerned, too, that her attention to minor details, real or imagined, served as a signal to those around her that she retained control of both the narrative and the social context. The discussion drifted to committee appointments, a subject that, in Little Netherford, was fraught with understated tension. A seemingly innocuous note in the records indicated that a minor position had been reassigned, though the rationale was left unexplained. Purbright considered the implications. A reshuffling of duties might appear trivial, yet in a community so attentive to appearances, even minor adjustments could reveal rivalries or obscure resentments. Mrs. Darrow spoke of these changes with a tone of gentle authority, yet her eyes betrayed a faint hesitation, a flicker of concern regarding how the inspector might interpret these subtle alterations. Fenwick, who had arrived unannounced, observed the proceedings with quiet attentiveness. He made no direct comment, yet his presence alone seemed to recalibrate the dynamics of the room. Purbright noted the interplay of glances between the widow and the preacher, a slight incline of the head, a faint lift of the brow, gestures that suggested unspoken communication and shared awareness. Even absent explicit conversation, the social cues conveyed a mutual recognition of subtle influence. The inspector filed these details with care, aware that minor behavioral shifts often presaged more significant revelations. During a pause in the examination, Purbright turned his attention to the margins of the records where small handwritten notes indicated concerns about prior donations and minor disputes. These annotations, though innocuous in appearance, suggested ongoing negotiations over propriety, the management of perception, and the implicit control of reputation. Each note hinted at a hierarchy of influence that extended beyond formal titles, demonstrating the quiet power of social knowledge in maintaining the delicate equilibrium of village life. As the afternoon waned, Purbright prepared to conclude his review, yet he paused at one particular ledger. A brief annotation, almost hidden by an ink blot, referenced an event described as unremarkable, yet potentially delicate in interpretation. The vagueness of the note, combined with its placement among otherwise routine records, piqued his curiosity. He looked to Mrs. Darrow, whose expression remained composed, yet contained the faintest trace of something unsaid. A subtle flicker of caution, quickly masked by a polite smile. Purbright left the vicarage with his usual discretion, his mind cataloguing the delicate patterns he had observed, minor omissions, subtle phrasing, carefully managed appearances, and the occasional hint of concealed tension. Little Netherford maintained its outward calm, yet beneath that veneer, reputations quivered, small rivalries lingered, and latent anxieties whispered in quiet gestures and marginal notes. And as he walked through the village square, the lingering impression of the annotated ledger raised a single, understated question. What events, seemingly trivial in themselves, might conceal the key to understanding the deeper currents of social influence, and who among the villagers would be the first to reveal it, consciously or unwittingly? The morning in Little Netherford was unusually still, a quiet, punctuated only by the faint rustle of leaves along the narrow paths between neatly clipped hedges. Purbright, having finished his examination of the parish records the previous day, elected to stroll through the village gardens, a customary place for residents to meet with civility and discretion alike. Mrs. Darrow appeared at the gate, impeccably dressed, her parasol tilted at the precise angle of propriety. She greeted him with a formal nod, and without invitation he fell into step beside her, aware that the simple act of walking together could serve as a subtle test of social poise and awareness. The conversation began innocuously, concerning the condition of the flower beds and the timing of seasonal plantings. Yet beneath the surface, Purbright detected the usual currents of observation and appraisal. Mrs. Darrow spoke with measured interest, her gaze occasionally flicking to the benches along the path where neighbours might appear. The villagers' presence, or absence, was noted with the same careful calculation as the arrangement of petals, and Purbright, ever attentive, catalogued these subtleties. Even the postmistress, passing briefly with her ledger tucked under one arm, cast a glance at the pair that was polite yet observant, as if gathering small insights to be considered at leisure. Fenwick, the preacher, appeared midway along the garden path, pausing to observe a particularly well-tended rosebush. His attention was quiet but precise, and the gesture invited speculation, admiration, critique, or perhaps a subtle test of those present. Purbright noted the faint shift in Mrs. Darrow's posture, a slight stiffening imperceptible to casual observers, but unmistakable to one accustomed to reading village comportment. It was the mark of someone aware that social equilibrium was delicate, that the presence of a stranger, however polite, could provoke recalibration in even the most confident household. Discussion of the bazaar naturally arose, though phrased in the guise of horticultural metaphor. A single mislaid flower may alter the symmetry of an arrangement, Mrs. Darrow remarked, allowing the remark to carry double weight. Fenwick nodded, ostensibly regarding the rosebush, yet his eyes flicked toward a nearby bench where the flower committee chair had appeared to pass the time. The implication was delicate but unmistakable. Minor details, when ignored, might reveal wider truths about attentiveness and reliability. Purbright, following the exchange with meticulous care, considered the significance of observation itself as a form of influence, the act of watching more instructive than any overt comment. A brief silence settled as the three walked, broken only by the faint chime of the village clock and the distant bleating of a goat from a neighboring farm. In that quiet, minor gestures took on amplified meaning. Mrs. Darrow, adjusting her gloves, allowed her fingers to brush a small note tucked into her handkerchief, and Purbright, noting the motion, inferred that some private communication, written or mental, was being rehearsed with discretion. Fenwick's gaze, serene yet deliberate, suggested recognition without intrusion, a polite acknowledgement of unspoken understanding. The conversation resumed with a discussion of parish duties, each remark phrased with careful neutrality. "It is remarkable," Fenwick observed, "how even the smallest obligations may reveal a community's character when undertaken with attentiveness or neglect." Mrs. Darrow responded with an agreeable nod, but her eyes briefly sought the vicarage windows, as if measuring the audience beyond the immediate path. Purbright noted the subtle interplay, gestures designed to reassure, to signal propriety, and to maintain authority without overt assertion. Each participant's conduct carried dual purposes, simultaneously civil and evaluative. As the garden path curved toward the small pond, a minor disturbance drew Purbright's attention. A folded piece of paper, likely dropped in transit, lay half concealed by the edge of a flower bed. He picked it up discreetly, noting the handwriting, careful, deliberate, and seemingly addressed to no one in particular. The content was innocuous, annotations regarding flower arrangements, but the choice to leave it unattended suggested either distraction or a covert message intended for select eyes. Mrs. Darrow, observing the action, maintained her composure, yet a faint tightening around her lips betrayed recognition, an acknowledgement of significance without the necessity of verbalization. They paused beside the pond, where the water reflected the afternoon light and the subtle anxiety that accompanied careful scrutiny. A duck glided past, oblivious to the human calculations unfolding along the bank. Fenwick remarked on the symmetry of the reflections, a poetic aside that also suggested the mirroring of public and private behaviour. Purbright considered the remark, noting that even the most neutral observations in Little Netherford could function as prompts for self-examination or silent comparison. The village's equilibrium depended upon these micro-assessments, each citizen silently judging both action and omission in equal measure. As their walk concluded, Purbright noted a final interaction. The flower committee chair, emerging from a nearby path, nodded toward Mrs. Darrow with the faintest mixture of deference and private inquiry. The widow returned the gesture with controlled warmth, her eyes flicking briefly to Purbright before settling on the committee member. The small exchange, almost imperceptible to casual observers, suggested that the wheels of observation and influence were turning, that reputations were being weighed, and that the preacher's presence had subtly accelerated the village's internal appraisal. Purbright departed along the cobbled lane toward the vicarage, reflecting on the nuances of the morning. No overt scandal had transpired, no voices had risen in confrontation. Yet he carried with him the quiet accumulations of observation, gestures, glances, and minor anomalies in behavior that collectively hinted at unsettled loyalties and latent rivalries. And as the sun dipped lower, he noted with mild intrigue a final subtlety. Fenwick paused at the gate, his eyes following the inspector with a deliberate, unhurried attention, as if to suggest that the small curiosities of Little Netherford might yet reveal themselves in time. A silent question lingered, Who, among these carefully composed villagers, would first reveal the truths that their civility had so assiduously concealed? The late afternoon in Little Netherford brought a subdued luminosity, filtering through the lace curtains of Mrs. Darrow's drawing-room and casting delicate shadows upon polished wood and embroidered cushions. Purbright arrived with a quiet knock, greeted with the customary grace that masked the subtle tension inherent in any unannounced visit. The widow, seated with impeccable posture, gestured toward a chair with her usual measured civility, and the inspector observed the slight, almost imperceptible twitch of her fingers as she smoothed the folds of her skirt, a signal perhaps of anticipation or discreet unease. Their conversation commenced with a discussion of parish correspondence, ostensibly trivial yet, in Little Netherford, imbued with significance. Letters had arrived from distant acquaintances, praising the village's commitment to propriety while subtly questioning the wisdom of recent hospitality extended to outsiders. Purbright noted the careful phrasing, compliments entwined with polite suggestions, observations designed to prompt reflection without overtly challenging reputation. Mrs. Darrow acknowledged each remark with courteous assent, yet her eyes, vigilant and sharp, betrayed her calculation of social nuance. Midway through their discussion, two unexpected visitors arrived. The postmistress and the flower committee chair, both presenting themselves with the practiced neutrality characteristic of villagers who bore social intelligence as a form of moral currency. Each greeted Mrs. Darrow with smiles tempered by caution, and the inspector perceived the delicate layering of intent beneath the surface. Polite inquiries were made regarding Fenwick's presence, phrased as routine curiosity, yet the inflection suggested an understated tension, a desire to probe while preserving civility. Tea was poured with ceremonial precision, the clink of china emphasizing the subtle cadence of observation and measurement. Conversation drifted to minor domestic matters, repairs to the iron gate, the timing of flower deliveries, and the scheduling of committee meetings. But each comment carried implicit commentary, a calibrated means of assessing loyalty, attention to propriety, and the boundaries of influence. The postmistress, in particular, observed the room with discreet intensity, her eyes flicking occasionally toward Mrs. Darrow's hands, as if anticipating some small gesture of significance. Fenwick, arriving unannounced, contributed to the layered social dynamic with characteristic restraint. His observations were framed as general reflections upon village life, yet the phrasing suggested a deeper insight. One finds, he remarked softly, that even routine conduct may reveal priorities not immediately apparent. The words were innocuous in tone, but their implications carried weight. The flower committee chair, aligning herself with polite deference, responded with a nod that was measured in both tone and expression, masking subtle curiosity regarding the preacher's meaning. Purbright noted the ripples of internal calculation, the silent weighing of observation, against obligation, the quiet reassessment of long-held assumptions. Attention soon shifted to the parish bazaar, which, under Mrs. Darrow's stewardship, remained an arena of social stratification. Assignments for stalls, arrangements of displays, and the sequence of events were discussed with meticulous care. Each suggestion framed to maintain decorum while allowing insight into individual ambition and reliability. The postmistress offered a suggestion regarding the positioning of the refreshment table, phrased with impeccable politeness, yet the underlying intent was evident to Purbright, a subtle assertion of influence disguised as cooperation. Mrs. Darrow, without a trace of irritation, incorporated the advice into her planning, simultaneously asserting authority and acknowledging contribution. As the afternoon unfolded, minor revelations emerged through silence and indirect comment. A brief glance between Mrs. Darrow and the flower committee chair carried the weight of unspoken understanding, a recognition that small discrepancies in conduct might signify broader social implications. Fenwick's presence, though quiet, seemed to amplify this awareness, prompting reflection and occasional hesitation among the attendees. Purbright catalogued these nuances, noting how a gesture, a pause, or a carefully measured phrase could serve as both communication and test. The inspector's attention was drawn to a small notebook, inadvertently left open on the sideboard. Its pages contained annotations regarding donations, committee preferences, and informal observations about residents' behavior. The entries were innocuous in isolation, yet their aggregation suggested ongoing scrutiny, subtle judgments, and the careful management of perception. Purbright made a mental note of the handwriting, observing that it bore traces of meticulous care tempered by occasional frustration, the signature of someone balancing personal opinion with public propriety. As the visit drew to a close, the visitors rose with the customary grace, offering polite assurances that they would confer further at the next meeting. Mrs. Darrow escorted Purbright to the door, her expression serene, yet attentive, her eyes flicking once toward the open notebook before settling on him. A final gesture, a brief, deliberate pause, the faint lift of an eyebrow, implied awareness without disclosure. It was a reminder that in Little Netherford even the most ordinary interactions were layered with subtle evaluation, and that the smallest signs might reveal intentions or inconsistencies invisible to the casual observer. Purbright departed along the cobbled lane, cataloguing the accumulation of observations, letters suggesting latent concern, the measured politeness masking rivalries, Fenwick's presence as a quiet instigator, and Mrs. Darrow's careful orchestration of appearances. The village, outwardly composed, was quietly engaged in a network of observation and subtle negotiation, each individual balancing propriety, ambition, and conscience. A final, almost imperceptible detail lingered in his mind. The postmistress, on leaving, paused briefly to adjust her scarf and, in doing so, cast a glance that was neither accidental nor entirely neutral. The gesture, fleeting yet deliberate, suggested awareness of matters not yet articulated, a quiet question poised between observation and revelation. What, in the subtle currents of Little Netherford, would first yield the truth hidden beneath its polished surface? The morning light fell gently through the parlour windows of Mrs. Darrow's vicarage, casting a lattice of pale shadow across the polished floorboards. Purbright arrived promptly, greeted with the customary measured civility that masked an undercurrent of anticipation. The widow, seated with an air of composed authority, gestured toward a chair, her gloved hands resting lightly upon the arms. She appeared serene, yet the faint tightening around her eyes suggested the careful management of an internal register, an unspoken vigilance that had become second nature in Little Netherford. On the sideboard lay a small collection of letters carefully arranged by date and sender. Their envelopes bore the marks of both distant civility and local subtlety, each bearing phrasing that demanded interpretation, compliments interwoven with the faintest insinuations, inquiries couched as observations, and warnings hidden beneath the veneer of politeness. Purbright, with the precision of habitual scrutiny, began to examine the correspondence. The first letter, typed in formal script, praised Mrs. Darrow's hospitality, while hinting that extended attention to outsiders might inadvertently invite critique. He noted the delicate interplay between encouragement and veiled reproach. A second envelope, written in a flowing hand, expressed admiration for the parish's diligence, yet included a postscript suggesting concern over procedural accuracy in the handling of charitable contributions. The choice of wording was deliberate, no accusation, yet enough to prompt reflection and self-assessment. Mrs. Darrow acknowledged the letter with polite gravity, folding her hands neatly, while allowing a faint glance toward the inspector as though seeking reassurance or confirmation that her interpretation aligned with propriety. Purbright, noting the subtle tension, offered a brief observation about the prudence of measured responses to critique, phrased with a civility that mirrored hers. The discussion soon turned to committee matters where small differences of opinion revealed layered hierarchies of influence. The Flower Committee chair had submitted a note suggesting a minor reallocation of duties, phrased with impeccable courtesy, yet carrying the undertone of evaluative judgment. Mrs. Darrow, reading aloud, emphasized the collaborative nature of the suggestion, yet her eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of concern regarding potential challenges to her authority. Purbright recorded the nuance, appreciating the delicate tension between acknowledgement and assertion, a signature feature of village social dynamics. Mid-morning brought a visitor, the postmistress, whose presence, though brief, introduced an immediate recalibration of awareness. She arrived with the habitual politeness, bowing slightly and adjusting her ledger before offering her observations on recent deliveries and minor irregularities in correspondence. Each remark, though phrased as matter of fact, carried latent significance, prompting the widow to weigh responses with care. Fenwick, appearing as if by coincidence, observed the interaction quietly, his demeanor calm yet attentive, providing a subtle reminder that scrutiny often accompanied civility. The conversation shifted naturally to the upcoming charity bazaar. Assignments, displays, and public introductions were discussed with an air of precision, each participant mindful of social perception. Fenwick contributed an observation about the subtle social dynamics inherent in public gatherings, phrased as a general reflection rather than direct advice. Even minor interactions, he suggested, may reveal patterns of behavior one might not otherwise observe. The remark, delivered softly, elicited a near imperceptible shift in posture among the attendees, as if acknowledging the latent consequences of small gestures. Purbright's attention returned to the letters. A particular note, partially concealed beneath others, contained instructions for committee reports, phrased in a way that emphasized prudence and discretion. The choice of language was remarkable. Every word balanced politeness with implicit oversight. Mrs. Darrow, noticing his scrutiny, smiled faintly, folding the note with deliberate care, conveying recognition without revealing private thought. It was a minor act, yet, in the village context, significant, a marker of awareness and control maintained without overt assertion. A subtle episode arose when the postmistress, departing, paused at the doorway. She adjusted her scarf in a gesture that was almost imperceptible, yet deliberate, casting a glance toward the sideboard and the letters thereupon. The motion conveyed more than curiosity. It hinted at a recognition of concern or concealed knowledge, an unspoken acknowledgement of social intelligence at work. Purbright, observing carefully, catalogued the gesture alongside prior interactions, recognizing the emergent pattern of subtle signals that threaded through village life. As the morning progressed, minor contradictions became apparent. Letters praising diligence contrasted with annotations indicating concern for overlooked detail. Recommendations for collaboration subtly suggested prior lapses in propriety. Purbright noted how these discrepancies, while individually insignificant, collectively revealed the pressures of reputation and expectation. Mrs. Darrow, maintaining outward composure, navigated the interplay with habitual elegance, affirming civility while subtly asserting authority. The inspector recorded the nuances, the quiet negotiations, the balance of power, and the understated recalibrations that defined interactions in Little Netherford. By late morning, Purbright prepared to depart. He rose with measured politeness, acknowledging the subtle tensions and layered meanings that had unfolded. Mrs. Darrow escorted him to the door, her expression serene yet attentive, conveying awareness without disclosure. As he stepped onto the cobbled lane, the faint flutter of a letter caught his eye, a missive partially protruding from a mailbox, its handwriting familiar yet enigmatic. Though he did not open it, the presence of the letter, poised as if awaiting observation, suggested the potential for revelation or oversight, a reminder that even the most controlled social structures could conceal emergent truths. Purbright walked onward, cataloguing the morning's subtleties, letters as instruments of influence, glances as silent assessments, and gestures as proxies for communication. The village remained outwardly composed, yet beneath the polite exterior, reputations, anxieties, and latent judgments wove a complex lattice. And in the quiet accumulation of minor signs, one question emerged, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. Which among these careful observations would first illuminate a truth that had long remained hidden, and which, villager, with subtle miscalculation or deliberate insight, might unknowingly tip the balance? The afternoon sun slanted obliquely across the lace curtains of Mrs. Darrow's drawing-room, illuminating dust motes that danced as if in quiet anticipation of observation. Purbright arrived as punctual as ever and was greeted with the measured civility that had become the hallmark of village encounters, a nod, a brief smile, and an invitation to sit. The widow herself remained composed, hands folded lightly upon her lap, though the faint tension along the line of her jaw suggested attentiveness to matters yet unsaid. It was the familiar interplay of decorum and subtle calculation that had long defined Little Netherford's social landscape. Tea was poured with deliberate precision, the clink of china marking intervals in conversation and observation alike. Discussion commenced with the usual civility, minor corrections to previous committee minutes, the scheduling of upcoming parish events, and superficial remarks on recent weather. Yet, as often occurred in such gatherings, each phrase carried a weight of latent meaning. Purbright noted the half-pause before replies, the careful phrasing of suggestions, and the polite nods that disguised both doubt and calculation. Here the mundane was weaponized by subtlety, and each participant practiced a form of social archery aimed at measuring influence without confrontation. The Flower Committee chair, seated across the table, initiated a topic concerning the forthcoming bazaar's refreshments. Her voice was gentle, her words courteous, yet they bore an implied critique of prior arrangements. "One wonders," she remarked, "whether the sequence of service might best reflect the expectations of our guests, rather than our habitual convenience." The statement, superficially practical, carried the weight of judgment. Mrs. Darrow, maintaining a serene demeanour, acknowledged the remark with a faint incline of her head, simultaneously affirming civility while subtly asserting authority. Fenwick, seated nearby, observed without comment, though his posture indicated keen attention to the silent dynamics unfolding. The inspector, attentive to nuance, noted the subtext of minor gestures, the brief tightening of a hand around a teacup, a flick of the eyes toward the doorway, and the occasional, almost imperceptible shift in posture. These were the instruments of reputational negotiation in Little Netherford, the quiet equivalents of accusation or praise in a society that prized discretion above candour. A slight cough from the postmistress, ostensibly to clear her throat, seemed to punctuate a latent tension, as though the polite room required occasional punctuation to signal awareness of potential discrepancies. Letters, as always, formed a focal point. A folded note, placed deliberately near Mrs. Darrow, contained suggestions for minor changes to stall assignments at the bazaar. Purbright observed her fingers brush the envelope in passing, a motion that conveyed recognition without declaration. The annotation within, though unremarkable in isolation, suggested ongoing scrutiny and management of social equilibrium. It was a subtle, silent communication, an instrument of influence as effective as any spoken remark. As conversation drifted toward parish donations, minor contradictions became apparent. An account previously marked as complete contained marginal notes questioning timeliness. A contribution praised in correspondence bore annotations hinting at dissatisfaction with allocation. Mrs. Darrow navigated these subtleties with practiced composure, acknowledging observations without conceding authority. Fenwick's occasional remarks, carefully neutral in tone, invited reflection without overt criticism. Purbright catalogued the layers of observation and response, aware that even the smallest gesture might conceal significant insight. The afternoon's attention shifted briefly to the postmistress, whose ledger had been left conspicuously on a side table. She moved to retrieve it, adjusting her scarf with a precision that seemed choreographed, and cast a glance at Mrs. Darrow and Fenwick. The gesture, fleeting yet deliberate, suggested awareness of matters not yet articulated, a quiet signal that observation extended beyond immediate conversation. Purbright, recognizing the significance of such movements, noted the interplay between vigilance and discretion, the manner in which social intelligence operated as both shield and instrument in the village hierarchy. A particularly telling moment occurred when a minor discrepancy in the allocation of stalls was discussed. The flower committee chair, referencing her note, expressed concern that one arrangement might unduly favor a particular participant. The phrasing was gentle, almost apologetic, yet it implied an evaluative judgment. Mrs. Darrow acknowledged the concern, responding with measured calm, but her eyes conveyed subtle calculation. Fenwick, listening attentively, offered a brief reflection on the importance of proportionality and perception, framing his commentary as general wisdom while subtly highlighting the potential for oversight. As the gathering drew to a close, Purbright rose, offering the customary acknowledgment of civility. Guests departed with careful attention to propriety, each gesture serving dual purposes, politeness and observation. Mrs. Darrow escorted him to the door, her expression composed yet attentive, as though measuring the inspector's perception, even as she maintained her own. The faintest hint of a smile suggested satisfaction with the equilibrium preserved, yet it did not dispel the subtle tension that lingered beneath appearances. Outside, the village remained calm, sun-warmed and orderly, yet Purbright's mind catalogued the accumulated nuances, minor contradictions, fleeting gestures, and silent signals that collectively hinted at unresolved tensions. A final observation, quiet and almost imperceptible, lingered in his awareness. The flower committee chair, as she passed the gate, cast a glance over her shoulder that seemed to measure both Mrs. Darrow and the inspector, as if anticipating discovery without acknowledging intent. It was a subtle question poised in silence, suggesting that in Little Netherford the revelation of hidden truths might arise from the smallest of movements, and that the next shift in equilibrium could emerge from the quietest of observations. The village of Little Netherford lay in soft evening light. The cobbled lanes and neatly clipped hedges bathed in a gentle glow that magnified the precision of each cultivated garden and window display. Purbright, strolling toward Mrs. Darrow's vicarage one final time, noted the subtle shifts in atmosphere. Shutters closed slightly earlier than usual, doors ajar with careful discretion, and the faint murmur of conversations in doorways that halted abruptly as he passed. The village, though outwardly serene, was suffused with the accumulated weight of observation, conjecture, and reputational management that had defined the preceding days. Mrs. Darrow greeted him at the door with a measured calm, offering the customary nod and invitation to enter. Her composure remained impeccable, though Purbright detected the faintest trace of expectation in her posture, a quiet readiness for resolution without overt declaration. Tea was served with ceremonial precision, each cup a vessel not only for refreshment, but for the unspoken protocol of scrutiny and civility. Conversation commenced with the customary discussion of minor matters, parish schedules, committee updates, and the anticipated success of the bazaar. Yet beneath these ostensibly mundane topics lay the patterns of perception, influence, and subtle hierarchy that Purbright had catalogued over previous visits. Letters, carefully arranged on the sideboard, drew immediate attention. Each envelope bore the marks of distant civility and local subtlety, the text within a blend of praise and oblique admonition. Purbright inspected the documents with meticulous attention, noting patterns of concern and emphasis, which names appeared most frequently, which annotations suggested ongoing scrutiny, and which phrasing implied both commendation and mild reproach. Mrs. Darrow observed quietly, her hands folded lightly, acknowledging his inspection with faintly lifted eyebrows, signalling recognition without explicit comment. The Flower Committee chair arrived promptly, offering greetings that balanced cordiality with the slight undercurrent of evaluation that had become familiar. Her discussion centered on stall arrangements, minor allocations of responsibility, and the order of public presentations. Each remark, carefully phrased, carried subtle implications, a suggestion here, a reserved observation there, each designed to measure both attention and compliance. Mrs. Darrow, serene and deliberate, integrated the input without overt concession, signaling authority while respecting the social protocols of mutual observation. Fenwick, appearing with his usual quiet deliberation, contributed reflections on village decorum, phrased as general commentary, yet carrying an implied consideration of individual behavior. Even minor acts, he noted softly, may illuminate patterns of propriety or the lack thereof depending upon observation and response. The remark, innocent in tone, caused slight recalibrations in posture and expression among the assembled participants, each processing both the content and its latent implications. Purbright catalogued these reactions, recognizing the interplay of perception, restraint, and strategic disclosure that had governed Little Netherford's social interactions. A brief pause occurred when the postmistress appeared, ledger in hand. Her gaze, sweeping the room with careful measurement, seemed to reconcile observed conduct with expected propriety. She adjusted her scarf delicately, casting a glance toward Mrs. Darrow and Fenwick that suggested recognition of subtle signals without overt interrogation. The gesture, fleeting yet deliberate, exemplified the manner in which silent communication and observation operated as instruments of influence and awareness within the village hierarchy. Purbright made a mental note, appreciating the layered texture of intention, propriety, and reputational caution that each participant brought to the gathering. Attention shifted momentarily to a minor discrepancy in donations and committee contributions. A previously unnoticed annotation in one letter hinted at oversight in distribution. Mrs. Darrow, reading aloud with unruffled calm, acknowledged the concern while subtly framing the matter as an administrative curiosity rather than a moral failing. The Flower Committee chair offered no dissent, merely a slight nod, while Fenwick's eyes, calm yet attentive, suggested awareness of potential implications without pronouncement. The interaction, though understated, revealed the equilibrium of influence and observation that had defined the village's social life. As the evening progressed, the conversation moved toward reflection. Minor tensions, once latent, were acknowledged indirectly through phrasing, gestures, and measured commentary. Purbright noted the resolution emerging from civility, the delicate recalibration of priorities, and the quiet acknowledgement of oversight or discretion. Letters were replaced upon the sideboard, gestures were executed with precision, and each participant seemed to recognize the collective balance restored, even as unspoken questions lingered in the periphery of thought. Finally, Purbright rose, offering courteous thanks for the hospitality and subtle insights gleaned over successive visits. Mrs. Darrow escorted him to the door, maintaining serene composure, her eyes conveying acknowledgement without disclosure. As he stepped into the quiet street, the village exhaled a muted, orderly calm. Yet one detail lingered in his observation. A small envelope, previously unnoticed, had been tucked beneath the sideboard, its placement deliberate yet ambiguous. Its presence implied further observation, another layer of communication or oversight, and a silent question poised between propriety and revelation. Purbright walked the final stretch through the dusky village, reflecting on the delicate web of reputation, subtle rivalry, and moral scrutiny that had defined the interactions over the past days. No dramatic disclosure had been required. No raised voice or confrontation had unsettled the carefully cultivated order. Yet within the subtle gestures, letters, and unspoken signals, he perceived the architecture of awareness and restraint. And as the evening light waned, he considered the quiet truth of Little Netherford, that revelation, influence, and judgment often operated silently, and that the smallest gesture or overlooked envelope might one day shift the balance of understanding in ways both delicate and profound.